Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our 74th episode of the Clements Bookworm. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development here at the Clements Library. Today's meeting is being recorded to share online, and later this afternoon, you will receive an email with the recording and resources mentioned in today's broadcast. Just want to give you a quick tutorial in case you're joining us for the first time. We are happy to have you participate in the chat. We like to think of this as a bit of a community, so feel free to chime in and change the setting to everyone. My colleague Helen Harding will be monitoring the chat and also pasting helpful links in there. Those links will also be provided in that email that I mentioned. However, because things do get buried in the chat, if you have a question for Stephen, please put it in the Q&A section. You can also see the questions that other people are asking, and you can give them a thumbs up if it's a question you have so that it sends it to the top of the queue. As part of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program, we have the live machine captions on. Please take a moment to toggle those on or off as you desire, and you do have the option of changing the size of the font. I can only control so much of what you see, but you should be able to move the relative size of the screen and the presentation window to make it the best viewing possible for you. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of the history and culture of North America and the Caribbean up to about 1900. I would also like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. And today we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabeg ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library also acknowledges that it continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. All right, everybody, click quickly on the poll because we're about to discuss it. And I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Okay. Oh, it didn't update, but the question is, what modern day state was the ancestral home of the Muskogee Creek Indians? And so the answer is indeed all of the above, which several of you got. And of course, Georgia is the second most answered, and that is certainly true. So thanks everybody for letting us know, what you were thinking about that and what you might know.
That's a fun little poll.
Okay, and now it's my delight to introduce today's guest. Stephen Peach is an associate professor of history at Tarleton State University, which is a member of the Texas A&M University System in Fort Worth, Texas. He earned his PhD from UNC Greensboro and his MA and BA from Northern Illinois University. His research and teaching center on Indigenous peoples in the 18th and 19th century South. His book, Rivers of Power, Creek Political Culture in Native South, 1750 to 1815, was published by the University of Oklahoma Press earlier this year. It traces political alternatives to nationhood in Muskogee Creek country and argues that the Muskogee Creeks identified rivers as a source of political power, coalition building, and community strength. Welcome, Stephen.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Angela, and thank you for everyone for attending. I see 69 participants. That's exciting.
It is exciting. Yeah, thank you, everybody. Especially those of you who are in other time zones that make it a little more challenging to join us on a Friday morning. So, Stephen, one of the things that we often talk about on this program, and I know everybody's always interested in, is what made you decide to write this book?
Yes, so thank you for that question. There were many reasons why I wanted to write a book on Native Americans and particularly the Muskogee Creek Indians. First, that would have to do with a lot of courses that I took in graduate school that introduced me to the method and field of ethnohistory. And really, I see this book as kind of a love letter to ethnohistory in a way. So ethnohistorians are trained to examine a variety of primary source materials using the tools of historians and anthropologists to try to reconstruct the past according to the way the Native people would have understood it and would have experienced it. And having taken all kinds of courses on just American history with a pretty heavily white American narrative, I was immediately attracted to this ethno-historical approach. Basically, I wanted to understand how we can tell stories about the history of North America and the United States through the lens of Native people. And the Creek Indians, for me, are one way kind of into that approach to American history. Another reason that I wrote this book, especially about the Creeks, is that they were a very large indigenous population in the American South. By the middle of the 18th century or the 1700s, there were about 12,000 Creeks living in anywhere between 40 and 50 different towns. And many of these towns were quite large. There were hundreds of people living in a few key towns in Creek country, and many others were much smaller, particularly village or satellite settlements that were connected to larger Creek towns. But they populated the American South. They're all over the place. They're in Georgia, they're in Alabama, they're in Florida too. The Creek Indians who lived in Florida, particularly the Panhandle, were offshoots of a particular division of towns called the Lower Creek towns. And those people eventually became known as Seminoles by the early 19th century. And as a result of this kind of demographic power, the Creeks were an obstacle to the expansion of European powers, particularly the British Empire by the 18th century, certainly to the United States, which was a kind of empire by the end of the 18th century. And so colonial officials had to work with Native peoples. They had to trade with them, make treaties with them in order to get Creeks to do things that these officials wanted them to do. European empires wanted animal skins. They of course wanted Creek lands. They wanted Creek slaves in many cases. And that really was the result of a lot of warfare between colonial people and the Creek Indians. But really, for European empires or the United States to do much of anything in the American South, they had to kind of go through this very powerful group of Native people. Plus, the Creeks were the first to sign a treaty with the new constitutional United States, particularly in 1790, the Treaty of New York. So that's another reason that they're kind of important and sort of attracted me to this particular region and time period. And then finally, the Creeks are they're unique in the sense that their history generated a lot of records. There are far more primary sources about the Creeks than I could read. There's too many. There's thousands and thousands of pages coming from the Clements Library, from other archives and libraries around North America. And so it's a perfect group to study. They're so well documented because they have all these interactions with the British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, and of course the United States. And so there's this long paper trail that allows me to really examine their past. So there's a lot
That's
of reasons there, but
yeah,
years in
I
the
love
making.
that. I love that there's so many reasons, and I really do think that it does challenge how we think about the early American South, you know, to read your book and to hear your presentation. So with that, I will let you share your screen and continue the presentation. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. There, okay. All right, I want to start with a map. And this map comes from the Georgia archives in Atlanta, not from the Clements. But I think this is a great visual entry into who the Creek Indians were, where they lived, and the history of the American South in general. So this map was produced in the middle of the 18th century by a British cartographer named Emmanuel Bowen. He entitled it A New Map of Georgia, with part of Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. So this was produced on the eve of the French and Indian War, which broke out in 1754 between the British and French empires. And it kind of gives us an understanding of the state of the American South at this time. It included a variety of colonies and native populations, along with a variety of ports and colonial and native towns. There are all kinds of rivers coursing through the American South, as Bowen documents quite well. The Spanish arrived in this region in the 16th century and established the small settlement of San Augustine right here in the northeastern portion of Florida. And then later on in the 17th century, and specifically 1670, the English arrived on the Atlantic coast and set up shop at Charlestown, South Carolina, and then eventually went on to found the colony of Georgia with a port city at Savannah by the early 18th century. And then finally, the third European empire to penetrate this region was, of course, the French. They established New Orleans here by the early 1700s, along with a couple of settlements in and around Mobile Bay. One thing that really is, I don't know, surprising and almost shocking about this map is how honest Bowen is in acknowledging the presence of native populations. So I have the homelands of the Creek Indians contained within this blue box right here. The Creeks divided their society into 4 divisions or provinces. Bowen listed 3. So you have the Lower Creeks along the Flint and Chattahoochee rivers. And in fact, the Chattahoochee River today is the dividing line between the states of Georgia and Alabama. Some key towns among the Lower Creeks were Coweta and Cussita. Those were very important towns, had a lot of major political leaders who negotiated with other native populations and European authorities. Secondly, Bowen listed the Middle Creeks, and sometimes they're known as the Tallapoosa's, who primarily lived along the Tallapoosa River, right along here. The third province, Creek Province, that you can see in this map included the Upper Creeks, also known as the Abicas, or the Abica towns, who resided along kind of the central and northern portion of the Coosa River. Now, he didn't mention the fourth and final province, but it's kind of implied in the map right there with Alabama Fort. That fort was built by the French on permission of the Alabama Creek Indians, who spoke a slightly different dialect of the larger Muskogean family. And so the Alabamas constitute the fourth and final province there of Creek country. Now, all 4 of these divisions or provinces were associated with distinct rivers. And that's really one point I'm trying to make in my book, is that because the Creek Indians lived along rivers, and affiliated with those distinct river systems, that kind of inspired their political system. Often Creek leaders would meet with other native officials and colonial officials and invoke their riverine provinces. They would use terms like Tallapoosa's or Coosa's or Chattahoochees in order to talk about their towns and their local political world. So they kind of conflated power with rivers or power with water, which was certainly the wellspring of life for the Creek Indians. I mean, Creek women who did the farming relied on rivers to supply their crops with fresh water. But those rivers also had a political focus for the Creek Indians. Now, there are other native groups here that you can see in this map. You have the Choctaws a little bit to the west. They were another large population. They slightly outnumbered the Creeks by the middle of the 18th century. The Chickasaws were located to the north. There were only about maybe 1,000 Chickasaws living in a few distinct towns throughout the 18th century, but their numbers fluctuated, as did the demography of other native populations too. Oops, sorry. And then finally, you have the Cherokees, who lived in what is today primarily kind of western North Carolina, Tennessee, and the northern portion of Georgia and Alabama. So there's a lot going on this map. Bowen tries to interpret this for us, and I think he kind of does a good job. You can see down here, I have a yellow highlight. In that, Bowen says that these are Indians in amity with the English or the British Empire. And by that, he primarily means the Creek Indians, but also to some degree the Chickasaw Indians over here. And then to the west, the Choctaws were in amity with the French. And this is true. For the most part, the Choctaws traded and interacted with the French Empire. There's another reference down here to an action by the Creek Indians in the early 1700s, 1704 and 1705, in which a combined force of Creek warriors and Englishmen raided and really destroyed the mission communities that the Spanish Empire had established among the Appalachians and other native populations. And the Creeks actually took a lot of those Appalachians as slaves and then sold them to the English. One other thing I'll mention about this map is that you can see that the Creeks were strategically located kind of in the middle of all of these different colonial jurisdictions. You know, you have the French and the Spanish to the south, the English to the east. Sorry. And as a result, the Creeks were able to develop what's called diplomatic multilateralism. So in other words, they forged multilateral relations with multiple empires. Sometimes they traded with the English. But when the English raised prices on manufactured trade goods, the Creeks might go trade with the Spanish, or they might go trade with the French. And this allowed the Creeks to kind of play off the different European empires against each other. And that was one way that the Creeks were able to kind of maintain their autonomy and their power going all the way into the early to mid 19th century. So they're expert diplomats. They know how to use political language in order to create unity and strength within their society. And feel free to post any comments you might have about this map. There's other things we can talk about, but I should probably move on to my other slides. So for the rest of the talk, I want to discuss two core record collections that I looked at from the William Clements Library many years ago when I was a graduate student, and a lot of these sources have made their way into my book. These sources allow me to reconstruct early America and Native American history, but I use two for the most part, the William Henry Littleton papers and the Thomas Gage papers. Littleton was the governor of South Carolina in the late 1750s, while Thomas Gage, of course, was a general in the British Army, and he became the commanding general of the British Army following the French and Indian War in 1763. Now, one thing I'll note about these two record collections is that, you know, I use I don't know, but dozens, maybe even hundreds of pages of materials from these two particular record collections. And not one of those records is actually authored by Littleton or Gage. Instead, I'm looking at reports from traders and other British people who were sending their letters to Littleton and to Gage. And as a result, we have all these records that have been compiled by these two very important men in British North America. So it's just kind of a curious note that I wanted to mention there. I don't actually read anything from Littleton or Gage themselves. And there are other record collections, I should add, about Indigenous history available at the Clemens. I haven't looked at these, but this is a fantastic library for doing Indigenous history. So the French and Indian War, as I mentioned a little bit ago, erupted in North America in 1754. This would become the broader global 7 Years' War in 1756. It primarily pitted the British against the French for mastery of the North American continent. Eventually, though, the Spanish did join in on the side of their fellow Catholic power, the French. Britain's goals in the wartime South were primarily to recruit Native warriors and secure Native loyalty. In other words, the British didn't want the Creeks to continue trading with the French or the Spanish, because in the mind of the British, that wouldn't be a good ally. I mean, you should trade primarily with the British Empire if you're looking to support that empire and secure trade goods from it. Now, as a result of Britain's kind of wartime policy, this spawned all kinds of interesting primary sources, including this one here. It's something resembling a census or a list of various Creek towns. This comes to us from the middle of the war in 1758 from a British deerskin trader named Jerome Carton. He traded to the Creeks, the Chickasaws, and many other native groups in the middle of the 18th century. And he listed the 4 major divisions of Creek country that I mentioned before. So I have those here in quotes, the Lower Creeks, along with the other 3 major divisions. Sometimes they're collectively named the Upper Creeks, but when you get into the specifics, there are 3 distinct divisions, and you have the Abika, Tallapoosa, or Tallapoosie, as it's sometimes written, and then the Alabama. He goes on to list dozens of towns here, key headmen, and he also kind of takes notice of whom those headmen were trading with. He mentions one in particular, a headman named Wolfe, who lived in the town of Muckalosis. He wrote that Wolfe was a great, well, he said rouge, and maybe he meant like an important red or Indian. I don't really know, but I think he meant rogue. And he also wrote that, or observed that Wolfe was a true Swiss, which I find kind of humorous. This was someone who was neutral. He didn't want to get involved in this war among Europeans, and in fact, he preferred trading with multiple European empires, according to that doctrine of multilateralism. Carton notes throughout his census that the French, it's difficult to see, but I'm going to try to highlight it here with my cursor. The French made presents to a number of headmen, in this case in the Lower Creeks. And then down here in the Tallapoosa division, Carton also makes the observation that there are plenty of towns and headmen who were in the French interest. So in other words, Carton and many other British officials here during this war are trying to kind of surveil the Creeks. They want to know who they're trading with. They want to know what they're up to. It's a very kind of invasive way of producing records that I'm also able to use to talk about Creek politics and diplomacy. Now, the next year, 1759, proved quite momentous for both Creeks and the British. A Briton by the name of Edmund Atkin arrived in the Southeast as the new superintendent or the head official of the Southern Indian Department for the British Empire. And it was his goal to make diplomatic connections with Creek and other Native American leaders and to keep them on the side of the British Empire. Unfortunately, he was quite brash, arrogant, confrontational, and he demanded in every town that he went that the Creeks trade exclusively with the British. And he was quite direct about it. He threatened to suspend trade with any Creek towns who traded with other Europeans, particularly the French. So in the face of this kind of British unilateral trade policy, the Creeks again and again defended their multilateral trade policy, and this caused all kinds of friction between Atkin and various Creek leaders. A lot of this friction played out in the Tallapoosa town of Tuckabatchee. Atkin met with the Miko, or the head leader of Tuckabatchee, in the summer of 1759. The conversation between these two leaders unfolded for several hours. There's a dozen pages, very large pages of the back and forth between Atkin and this Miko, but eventually the Miko relented. He had been flying the French flag in the Tuckabatchee Square, and he took that flag down and put up the British flag in its place, thereby cementing an exclusive alliance with the British. So this Miko did relent. He did back off to some degree. But one thing I want to mention here is that, diplomacy did not just involve men. We know from the Clements records and many other primary sources that Creek women were everywhere. They weren't direct participants in diplomatic conversations, but they influenced conversations between Indians and whites. In this case, in Tuckabatchee, women provided ancillary support. They provided food to Creek and British men. They danced as a way to kind of culminate and celebrate the occasion of this alliance between Tuckabatchee and Atkin. And they otherwise practiced just traditions of hospitality in which women would host male emissaries in their town. So in other words, women were pretty important diplomatic agents in the American South, and especially in Creek country. One thing that I find kind of humorous, though, is that from the British point of view, they believed that Creek men were ordering Creek women around. So if you look at the source here, orders were given immediately for notice to be given to the women to prepare victuals for the square and to get ready to dance. It sounds like men are telling women what to do, but that's not how it would have been. We know from other sources that women were expected to do this just given their gender and given the fact that they're clan leaders. They have a lot of political influence in Creek society. And you see a similar dynamic unfolding in other areas of the American South too, among the Cherokees, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws. Women had a lot of influence, particularly in these diplomatic moments. So those summertime discussions in 1759 gave way to a larger assembly of Creek leaders and Atkin by the fall, by late September of 1759. According to the secretary who compiled this document, there were maybe as many as 150 principal or important leaders from Creek country who traveled to the town of Tuckabatchee to meet with Atkin and to hear this new British trade policy. This is kind of like another census similar to the Corton document, in that you can find numerous Creek towns organized by distinct Creek divisions: Tallapoosa, Abika, Lower Creek. You can see who attended, you can see who didn't attend. There are references to head warriors, to younger warriors. There's a few references to women and children who attended what really was one of the largest assemblies in Creek country up to this point. One thing I will mention here is right here up top, a note to bene. The Tuckabatchee Miko, the one who had agreed to stop trading with the French over the summer, absented himself and went to Pensacola. And that must have angered Atkin. Atkin didn't directly address it in his correspondence, at least I couldn't find that. But I think it's humorous that, you know, the town that's hosting this very large assembly in Creek country doesn't actually have its Miko, its head leader. He probably didn't want anything to do with Atkin by this point. But still, there were a lot of important Creek leaders who attended. So Atkin announces his trade policy. He warns the Creeks that if they continue to trade with the French, they're going to lose their trade goods from the British. Unbeknownst to Atkin, and possibly unbeknownst to most other Creeks in attendance, there was an assassination plot. A warrior from a lower Creek town, Cusida in particular, fell on Atkin with a pipe hatchet. So a pipe hatchet is kind of a double-edged object. On one hand, you can actually smoke tobacco in it and forge an alliance with someone with whom you'd like to trade or maybe go to war with, you know, have them on your side. So the pipe part symbolized diplomacy, but then it also had a hatchet, which symbolized death and violence. And so Atkin was nearly killed as a result of this. And this caused a furor. The whole assembly, both white and red, broke up, went their own way. And then the next day, Atkin, considerably bloodied, barely alive, continues to give the very same speech that he was giving the day before. He didn't learn his lesson. He continued to alienate the Creeks, but by this point, there were very few headmen in front of him listening to what he had to say. And later on, Atkin met with a leader named Gun Merchant to try to understand what had happened. Why was he nearly killed? Why didn't the Creeks want to meet with him? And you can kind of see this conversation unfolding according to this document down here. GM, Gun Merchant, he said that they were daunted and could make no answer. And the superintendent, why daunted? Tell me the reason. And then Gun Merchant replies, they had never been used to hearing or to hear such talks before and were considerably confounded. So this is diplomacy by rejection. Atkin had worn out his welcome. His trade policy violated Creek multilateralism, and he was sent packing. By the end of the year, imperial authorities in London had learned what had happened, and they fired Atkin and replaced him with a new superintendent who is John Stewart, and who would enact a much softer form of diplomacy. Now, one more point I want to make about the Creeks in the French and Indian War has to do with what I call local people or local actors. These are members of Creek communities who weren't elected to office, who didn't necessarily exercise a lot of power, but they still could kind of influence the direction of Creek country. So this included women, warriors, children, and elders, all of whom did have a political impact and a political say in Creek country. This is most apparent in the case of Mortar, a headman named Mortar. He was actually a relative of Gun Merchant, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, and lived in the town of Akchai. He wanted nothing to do with Atkin before Atkin was fired, and instead Mortar developed a relationship with the French Empire and the Cherokees, and actually planned to launch a grand attack against British backcountry settlements during the French and Indian War. But this alliance didn't really come to pass. It didn't really get off the ground because most Creeks were opposed to it. By the early 1760s, the vast majority of Creeks realized that their best trading partners were going to be the British. The British could always outsupply the French and the Spanish with more goods that were cheaper, durable, and in higher demand. And so as a result, you don't want to anger the British Empire. In this particular case, Mortar kind of learned the hard way. As a result of his alliance with the French and the Cherokees, his own people, his own community pushed back. According to a letter from Atkin to South Carolina Governor Littleton, Mortar's own warriors, and even the women of that town forced him to quit it, to give up. Now, it's hard to tell if those women were his relatives. I assume that they were, maybe a couple aunties, maybe some sisters, I don't know, maybe a grandmother. It's not entirely clear, but I'm going to kind of speculate that because women did have political influence, they were probably telling Mortar, like, hey, you need to cut out this alliance with the French and the Cherokees. And so he backs down. And in the coming years, he develops a relationship with that new superintendent that I mentioned, John Stewart. Which brings me to the second half of my presentation here. This is on an important intertribal or pan-Indian conflict involving the Creeks and their western neighbors, the Choctaws. So the French and Indian War ended in 1763 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris involving the British, the French, and the Spanish. The British are declared victorious. The French had to leave their possessions in Canada and in the Southeast, particularly in New Orleans and Mobile. The Spanish, for their part, vacated their possessions in Florida and turned that over to the jurisdiction of the British. And so from this point forward, the British Empire was the sole supplier of trade goods for most native communities in the South. I will say that the French gave New Orleans to the Spanish following this treaty, which meant that for those native groups living kind of close to New Orleans, such as the Choctaws, they could go trade with the Spanish, but that empire had spent a lot of money on the war. It wasn't really in a position to supply trade goods to native groups. So for the most part, native populations in the Southeast were trading principally with the British. And as a result, this heightened competition between different native populations. The Creeks and the Choctaws competed for access to white-tailed deer across Alabama and into Mississippi because those deer skins were kind of the currency that allowed those hunters to purchase goods from the British Empire. And before long, a war broke out. By the middle of the 1760s, dozens, possibly hundreds, were killed on both sides. But what's fascinating to me about this war is that it generated a long paper trail with a variety of different records that are lengthy and nuanced. One set of records includes Headman's speeches, or what they called talks. So I have here one page of several pages of talks from the Creeks to the Choctaws with the tokens of peace, which I'll explain here in a minute. This is from 1770, about 4 years into the Creek-Choctaw War. It's interesting to me that the Creeks and other native groups referred to these speeches as talks. So for the most part, native people are illiterate in the 18th century, and they dictate a speech to a scribe, usually a European scribe, who records their speech in writing and then sends that speech to the intended recipient. Now, when that person receives the message and they read it aloud, it's as if the author of that message was talking. And speech had a kind of sacred connotation too among the Creeks and other native groups. So this is how native populations conceptualize communication. You know, these speeches are talks that should be read aloud for everyone to hear, and that would really kind of encourage honesty and unity, particularly during a period of warfare. Mortar, who I mentioned in the last slide, coordinated with another important Creek headman by the name of Amestaciguo, who lived in a different town. These two men primarily led the peace initiative to end the Creek-Choctaw War by the 1770s. And in addition to sending talks to the Choctaws, they also sent diplomatic tokens, things like tobacco, white feathers, and beaded strings, all indicated peace, or at least the hope of peace between the Creeks and the Choctaws. And the Choctaws, I should mention, reciprocated. They also sent their own talks and their diplomatic tokens to the Creeks as well. You can kind of see references here to these diplomatic objects. The tobacco and beads contained in this particular message were actually sent by an Alabama headman, but it came from Mortar, who acted on the Alabama's behalf. You kind of see a lot of that political layering within these diplomatic situations. And then this talk and tokens were sent to British officials who then sent it to the Choctaws. But there's a lot to unpack here, a lot of references to distinct headmen, towns, a lot of imagery and metaphor about kind of clearing a path in order to obtain peace between the Creeks and the Choctaws. It takes a lot of time to unpack the meaning within these sources. But that's one example of a record that I use in my book to discuss this war. Now, buried within these records are a few references to what I think is one surprising diplomatic token or object sent by the Creeks to the Choctaws. And this was a wampum belt. So wampum belts are associated with the Iroquois League, who lived in, and some of whom continue to live in, New York State, particularly upstate New York and the Finger Lakes region. So think of groups like the Mohawks, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Senecas. They were a very powerful indigenous confederacy, and they had a pretty close relationship with the British Empire by the 18th century. Wampum refers to really shell beads, mollusks, that you could arrange in the form of a belt. And I have one example here of a belt that was actually commissioned by the United States in the 1790s under President George Washington, and it was given to the Iroquois League. And a lot of these belts contain symbols that are designed to demonstrate peace and understanding between two or more parties. And this particular belt that I have here, just an example of a wampum belt, you see the 13 United States. So 13 people joined in hands with, this person here is supposed to be the kind of mythical founder of the Iroquois League, who united the different Iroquois groups. And then on the other side, you have Washington himself, President Washington. So you have the two great leaders of two different societies joined together in the longhouse, which is kind of a familial metaphor, for political and diplomatic agreement. So with that in mind, it is quite surprising that the Creeks, who lived 1,000 miles to the south, were crafting wampum belts. This wasn't a very common tool, but it's something I found in a few cases in the Clemens records. It seems that the Muskogeans borrowed wampum belt diplomacy from their Iroquoian neighbors far to the north. Perhaps to kind of indicate the gravity of the situation. This was a war that was dragging on, claiming a lot of lives, instilling a lot of fear in the region. So I don't know, desperate times called for desperate measures. But it does seem to be the case that the Creeks fashioned a wampum belt that would have been without, like kind of outside the tradition of Muskogean diplomacy. I still have a lot more research to do on this particular point. I raise it in one of my book chapters. I'd like to see if there are other examples of wampum belt diplomacy in the Southeast, but it is something that's quite rare. But it does show you the creativity on the part of these different Southeastern Indians. And finally, these diplomatic records that I've been talking about are just littered with the names of British officials. People like John Stewart or Charles Stewart, who was his deputy and relative, and many other British officials. Charles Stewart, in particular, served as an intermediary for the combatants, for the Creeks and the Choctaws. He was the one who physically carried Creek talks and tokens to the Choctaws. and then did the reverse, carried talks and tokens from the Choctaws to the Creeks. And he did this from his base in Pensacola, Florida. And this to me reverses older stories about Europeans dictating terms to Native people, getting Native people to do the bidding of European powers. Instead, we see Native people drafting somewhat reluctant imperial authorities to serve Native purposes. It's not that Charles Stewart really wanted to do this work. It was dangerous to travel between Creek and Choctaw societies during this war, but he needed to do it in order to secure the cooperation of the Creeks and Choctaws, particularly as the imperial crisis along the eastern seaboard was heating up. You know, you have those rebellious colonists in places like Virginia and Boston who are denouncing the new direction of British imperial policy, the coming of the Revolutionary War. So the Stuarts need to do all they can to try to make the Creeks kind of more agreeable to British interests. And it worked in the end. The Stuarts helped to negotiate a conclusion to the Creek-Choctaw War, and that came like right in 1776 and 1777 as the British colonists on the eastern seaboard declared independence from the British. Okay. I've been talking a lot. I hope you found this enjoyable and informative, but I do want to offer a couple of, I think, three ideas with which to conclude my presentation here. So first, I think the most obvious one is that Indigenous people were so important in the history of early America and in American history in general. The distinct economies that took root in North America among colonists and indigenous peoples, the patterns of warfare and diplomacy, the various geopolitical arrangements involving multiple peoples, all were shaped by Native American agency and power. You just see Native people everywhere. They're consumers, they're traders, they're warriors, they're diplomats, they're scouts. They're just so central to the early American past. And how do we know that? It's because of the archive. It's because of records like the Littleton papers or the Gage papers. Native people are everywhere in the archive. So for anyone who's doing any sort of project on early America, whether it involves Native people or not, chances are you're going to find references to Indigenous people, to headmen, to women, to the towns in which they live, the traditions they practiced. So that's something to really kind of emphasize here as we talk about these very rich collections. Secondly, I think we should all embrace surprise and discovery in the archive. You just don't know what you're going to find. When I was a naive graduate student in 2013, doing my research at the Clements, I had no idea what I was going to find. My advisor did tell me to be on the lookout for the assassination attempt on Atkin, which I found, of course, and I shared with you, but I found a lot of other records. The census from Jerome Carton, for example, or the fact that someone like Charles Stewart, this very important British official, is kind of going back and forth between Creek and Choctaw societies to try to negotiate an end to that war. There are all kinds of things that I just didn't expect to find, and it's taken me a long time, years, to really understand the significance of these archival surprises. And finally, the nature of the sources, I think, is more and more complicated than at least I had been led to believe. I mean, sure, these records are British, they're European, they bear the imprint of European power, European voices, but so many of them include the words and the actions of Native people. I showed you an example of the talks from Mortar and Amestaciguo a couple of slides ago. Those words are probably their own. There's no reason for the scribe to misinterpret what those headmen were trying to say. No, the British and other Europeans want to understand what Native people are doing so that in the end, maybe they can better control and surveil those Native people. But that doesn't mean that those records aren't useful. They are very useful. We just need to read them against the grain, compare them to other primary sources to learn as much as we can about Native actions and their mindset. So the more we search for new records and reinterpret old ones, I think the more that we can see how dynamic and complicated and enriching the story of early America really was. All right, I will end it there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Should I stop sharing, Angela?
Yeah, I just
Okay,
bumped you anyway.
thank you.
Um, that was great. And I especially appreciate those archival takeaways at the end. I think that those are very helpful in understanding how this work is done. So thank you.
Oh,
I
it's a pleasure.
see that we have several questions already in the Q&A section. So everybody, keep putting your questions in there and we will get to them in a moment. I would just like to do a couple of housekeeping announcements and then we'll move on to questions. So next month will be in January 2025. Our next bookworm is a discussion with Robin Bernstein, who will be in conversation with Lakeisha Simmons about her new book, Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. So I hope that everyone will join us again, or at least watch the recording. Speaking of which, you are already registered for the Bookworm and will receive a reminder next month. And then you can choose whether to sign on live or wait for the email with the recording. We have a new exhibition opening in the new year. It will open on January 10th, and it's a fun exhibition, More Than Gray, Reimagining Early America in Full Color. This exhibit illuminates the brighter side of history, spotlighting all the color and vibrancy that are often concealed by the gray and sepia tones of pre-1900 American imagery. Come see the garish fabric colors, busy wallpaper patterns, and rainbow hues of books that just might challenge you to think of the past beyond black and white. And there will eventually be an online exhibit. It's not quite ready yet, so you can keep your eye out for that if you're a little too far away to come see the exhibit in person. And if you are going to be in Ann Arbor sometime before April 4th, we do have some tour dates available as well, where you would see the exhibit as well as taking a tour of the Clements. Stephen mentioned the wonderful sources that he used at the Clements Library. And so I wanted to mention that we are accepting applications for our 25-26 research fellows. And so we have some wonderful funding opportunities, long-term, short-term, week-long digital fellows in a variety of topics. And so if that is something that you might be interested in, please take a look. And if you know anyone who might benefit from a visit to Ann Arbor, please feel free to pass the information on to them as well. We have appreciated everyone's participation and community in this Bookworm program, and wish you a wonderful end to 2024. We hope that you'll continue to stay involved, because you certainly help to provide an avenue for these wonderful discussions. And if you are interested in sponsoring a future episode of the Bookworm, please feel free to get in touch with me. All righty. So let's take a look. I noticed that the first question, there's a lot of questions about language. And so the first one is from Sophie, wondering if Alabama is a French or Creek name.
So there are a variety of place names in the Southeast and in Oklahoma that are some sort of derivative of the Muskogean language family. And as far as I know, Alabama is one of them. Oklahoma is another. I know Oklahoma specifically derives from a Choctaw word. So yes, yeah, Alabama is certainly a Muskogean term. And I should mention something about the language. Most of these native populations in the Southeast, especially the big ones, like the Creeks, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, the Seminoles, they spoke dialects of the larger Muskogean language family. And that meant that those dialects were mutually intelligible to one another. So there were, some differences between Choctaw and Creek, for example, as far as I understand it. But there was enough similarity to the point where those two groups could communicate with each other. The outlier were the Cherokees. They spoke a dialect of the Iroquoian language family, very, very different from the Muskogean one. And in fact, they spoke a dialect that would have been very similar to, say, the Mohawks or the Senecas in the Iroquois League up there in New York. They also belong to that Iroquoian language family. And then there are some actually Siouan speakers, those who spoke a dialect of the larger Siouan language family, and I believe that's the Catawbas of South Carolina. And it wouldn't have been easy for Creeks, for example, to speak to or interact with the Catawbas as a result of those very different language families. And then there's some other like language isolates, I think they're called by linguistic anthropologists. I'd hate to say, I don't know if, trying to think if Yuchi is one of them. There's probably some expert right now, a participant who could answer that. I think Yuchi, but there's some other like isolates who really couldn't easily communicate with anyone across the Southeast unless they learned one of the dominant language families. So sorry to go down that rabbit hole, but yeah, there are some interesting points to make about language.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, no, I think there are. And in fact, the next question is Vince's, as you were talking about how to find these primary sources within the British records, he's wondering, are there records in the native languages that would have provided any of their views directly?
So not that I found, not in the Clements documents. The vast majority of those records are in English. I have used some Spanish records that were translated into English since I can't read Spanish. And I haven't found any references to the Muskogean language in those records either. I want to say there's some kind of smatterings of references to Muskogee in the French records, the Mississippi Provincial Archives, for example. I think there are some maybe like examples of like a Q&A between a particular native leader and a Frenchman, and some of that is in a Muskogean language, but I haven't used that, at least not in my book. A lot of the Creek language documents that people are using, not myself, really come from the 19th and 20th centuries when you start to have missionaries kind of penetrating the Southeast and other portions of North America. And those missionaries begin recording what were previously oral, spoken languages on paper. And so historians who are working on more modern topics can use those records to really get at the Muskogee voice, the Muskogee mindset through their own language, but not so much, unfortunately, in the colonial records.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that as an oral language and oral storytelling,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a good point. And so then these two questions I think are related because Marshall's wondering, where when they came to hear Atkins speak, did they understand the English language? Had they learned the English language? And, was there a particular method by which that happened? So that's part of the question, because then Sophie is also asking about those talks and wondering, when the scribes were writing and translating it, were they going in both directions?
So it seems to be the case that the more kind of important headmen who had more interaction with Europeans, whether that's British, French, or Spanish, may have learned a little bit of those European languages, but for the most part, the Creeks at that conference there in Takabachi would not have understood English. And that's sort of implied by Atkin's correspondence, in which he and his team basically talk about the existence of a few different translators. So Atkin speaks in English, and then you have kind of one or two British men who maybe learn Creek a little bit, and were able to translate to a Creek audience. And yes, there were some Creeks who learned the English language, but for the most part, you have to have these translators on hand who are kind of like doing a deep immersion into Creek culture. It seems to be the case too that a lot of the British traders who lived among the Creeks and other native people, and especially who married native women, learned a little bit of the language. And so those traders would be drafted to act as translators in these important kind of diplomatic situations.
And what about the scribes writing things back and forth? They're translating, right? And so
Yes. So in terms of the Creek-Choctaw War, as far as I could understand it from those records that I have available to me, the scribes and translators would write down the translation of Creek to English and then send that to Stewart, and then Charles Stewart in Pensacola, who would then employ one of his scribes and or translators to then translate the English into Choctaw, or maybe something kind of resembling Choctaw, so that the Creeks and Choctaws could communicate with each other via those scribes and translators. And as I mentioned before, I mean, there's enough similarity between the Creek and Choctaw languages that shouldn't have been too difficult for these Britons to be able to move these messages back and forth between these different native groups. I don't know enough about it. It's sort of implied to me. It is hard to know for sure, but that's the best answer I can give you, and that's pretty much what I say in my book.
right, right. Okay, all right, very interesting. So Pamela is wondering if there's if you encountered more details about what goods were traded back and forth.
Yeah, sorry, and I probably should have mentioned that when I was explaining Bowens Map there, and the importance of economic exchange between native populations and Europeans. So there are a lot of goods exchanging hands. So from the European side, they are selling, for the most part, guns. They're called trade guns or trade muskets in the sources, ammunition, metal tools, and woven textiles. Catherine Braun, she's a really important historian of the Creeks. She has an entire book about what's called the deerskin trade, and I'll get to deerskins in a minute. She has a variety of references in her book to all the different kinds of clothing that the Creeks and other native people were buying from the British. And that clothing was manufactured in Western Europe, shipped across the Atlantic world as kind of part of this broader consumer revolution that was unfolding in the 18th century. But Creeks also bought alcohol, particularly molasses-based whiskey from the British and other Europeans. Those are the trade goods primarily. A lot to do with warfare, clothing, and metal tools. The metal tools are important because Creek women incorporated metal into their farming practices. So before the advent of the deerskin trade, they're using stone, bone, and maybe wood to till the soil. And almost overnight, as some historians argue, Native women preferred the durability of steel to be able to farm their crops. That was a really important component there for them. Oh, and I should mention the Creeks also bought a lot of jewelry from the British. And both men and women were adorning their bodies with all sorts of jewelry, necklaces, earrings, kind of bracelets. Now, Native people were buying all of these manufactured goods with animal skins, primarily deer skins from the very populous white-tailed deer, but really any kind of fur-bearing animal could act as currency for the Creeks and other Native people to purchase manufactured goods from Europeans. And that's come to be known as the deerskin trade. Now, I will say, I don't talk about this in my book, but there was an Indian slave trade that preceded the deerskin trade. Its height was kind of like late 1600s to early 1700s, in which Native people went to war against each other. The Chickasaws and Choctaws, in particular, went to war against each other and took people captive, and then sold those Native captives to the English, who turned around and enslaved them. So in the town of Charlestown or other port cities on the Atlantic coast, there were a lot of Indian slaves who were working for English masters. And those slaves were the result of intertribal warfare among these different native populations. So they were a commodity, they were a trade good. But by the middle of the 18th century, when I kind of start my book, you don't see too many Indian slaves kind of moving around, being exchanged as commodities.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you. Um, this is an interesting question from Tom. He's wondering if the British were reluctant to admit that they had lost the Revolutionary War.
Oh, come into the Creeks. I should probably know the answer to that question. Well, what I will say is that the British didn't seem to care that in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, the British ceded their claim to territory on which the Creeks and other native people lived. So the eastern half, most of the eastern half of North America, goes from the British colonies to the new United States. And except for the Atlantic coast, most people living in the eastern part of North America, particularly in the Great Lakes, the Midwest, and the Southeast, they're native. They're native. That's their land. They were not invited to the treaty table. They also were not attending the 1763 Treaty of Paris that ended the French and Indian War. So I don't know about British reluctance and kind of admitting that to the Creeks, but the British were fine with transferring jurisdiction to the victorious United States. I don't think they really gave that a second thought, because diplomacy in their mind, in the end, involved white civilized nations. Native people didn't get to be party to that, certainly not to those important international agreements coming out of Paris. So, and the Creeks were outraged. In both 1763 and 83, the Creeks could not believe that these white colonial powers were trading all this land without Creek input. And the Cherokees were upset, the Choctaws, Chickasaws, they all send delegations to colonial cities and towns, and they just protest. Like, no, this is our land. How can you do this?
And actually that leads a little bit into the next question. You know, this idea of the time period that you're talking about, that there seems to be at least a sense of respect, even if it's grudging. But then, you know, where does it, you know, sort of go wrong?
Go wrong. I mean, I think it goes wrong in the transition from British rule to American rule. Sure, the British wanted to expand their colonies of Georgia and South Carolina. Their colonial charters said that they should be able to rule from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But the British don't claim land and don't act as a land-based empire in the way that the United States would. There's just kind of a difference of scale there. The United States, from the very beginning, like from the Declaration of Independence, in which Jefferson refers to Native people as merciless Indian savages, they want land. They don't care about the Native people living there, and that creates all kinds of warfare between Indians and whites. But there's also intertribal conflicts too. The Creeks and the Chickasaws actually go to war against each other for a variety of reasons by the 1790s. But for the most part, you have white citizens in Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, or what would become those states, who are just invading Creek country, invading Cherokee country by ultimately the hundreds of thousands. And they just want the land and the resources on that land. They want access to the rivers to transport goods and slaves. And they really want the fertile land that the Creeks have to be able to grow crops, and particularly cotton, by the 19th century. So as much as there always was some kind of tension between the British and the Creeks, for example, the United States would just change the game. It'd be a whole new calculus, and they would just claim land and really take it, in many cases, by force by the early 19th century.
Right. Trying to think, did we already talk about this a little bit? Was George Washington upset by the failure of Georgia to abide by the Treaty of New York?
Yeah, he was furious. He was furious. So was his war secretary Henry Knox. You know, they had really, it was Knox who was the brainchild of the American expansion policy, known as expansion with honor. Knox wanted to allow the U.S. to expand at a very peaceable rate by negotiating for land at the treaty table, making sure that Native leaders permitted the cession of land to white citizens. And the state, like Georgia or a state like Alabama later on, wasn't really interested in treaties. They just kind of moved in. Settlers just appropriated land and even homes where Native people were living. They didn't care too much about the formal process of diplomacy. But Washington and other federal officials did. They wanted that kind of expansion based on a kind of legal process that involved cooperation between both sides.
Sophie, she is making which is related a little bit to this, and says, as a Brit, I tend to think the American Revolution was very much about negating treaties with the native peoples.
Yeah, I mean, in a general sense, you're right. I mean, as I just said, I mean, this period of bloodshed erupted between Indians and whites after the Revolutionary War. But, you know, you still have a number of key indigenous populations who weren't going anywhere. The Creeks were still there in the early 19th century. The Iroquois were still there for the most part by the end of the 18th century, although some had migrated to Canada and other places. The Delawares and the Shawnees in the Ohio Valley, they're very mobile populations, so they're able to kind of pick up shop and kind of move around and get out of the way of white people. But they're there. They're still a presence. And as a result, that does force the United States to send treaty commissioners to negotiate with these different native groups and try to persuade them to give up their land. So, I mean, yeah, I think to some degree Americans didn't care too much about what we might understand as tribal sovereignty today. I don't really think they're thinking about it like that in the 18th century, but still, Native people do enough to force the Americans to the treaty table. And that goes for many of the groups in the Great Plains and kind of the western portion of North America. I mean, the federal government was making treaties with Native people into the 1870s. Before
Right.
Congress eventually ended that practice. I forgot when that was, 1875 or something like that.
That ends our very excellent questions. And thank you so much for your time and for, talking more about your book and your research. So, and thank you everybody who signed on today and participated in this discussion. Your excellent questions always add a lot. So we appreciate that very much. All right. Well, Stephen, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day. Stay warm.
Thank you. I'll try. And anyone is free to email me at peach@tarleton.edu if you want to talk more about history, archives. I'm available.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
That email is peach, just my last name at tarleton.edu. So here, I'll go ahead and type it in really quick.
Oh, thanks. That's great.
Why not? Why not? There we go. Thank you, Angela and Helen, for hosting. I've always loved the Clemens, so this was a lot of fun.
Oh, good. Well, hopefully you'll think up another project that will bring you back to the Clemens. Are you working on something new now that you finished this up?
I am. So I do want to continue doing some research on 18th century diplomacy, probably by returning to the Clemens at some point. I want to see if I can find more examples of wampum belts and other kind of diplomatic tokens. But I have moved on to a second, broader, I think, book project. Basically, I'm following the Creeks and other southeastern Indians to Oklahoma after removal. And I'm looking at their interactions with missionaries. And over time, this project has become something about indigenous education, which is kind of a hot topic right now in indigenous studies. So I'm interested in mission schools, common schools, faculty, student experiences, salary, a very, very different kind of topic, I think, from what the first book is about. But I'm still kind of using the Creeks as my anchor.
Right, right. Yeah. And interesting to see that whole arc of change in their culture and society.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you again and enjoy the weekend, everybody.
All right. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.